October 2118. I am King Henry the Ninth of England, the great-great-grandson of King Charles the Third. The way in which I have come to reign over the United Kingdom is perhaps the most controversial in the history of our monarchy. However, I believe that I have taken my rightful place on the throne. Having turned around the fortunes of this ailing country, accomplishing every goal that I set for myself along the way, I wish now to tell you the whole story that would lead to my ascension. Chapter 1. I had known that the country was beginning to crack long before I realised the extent of the damage that was being done. The first signs had come when I was called into a meeting with my chief accountant to tell me that my companies were hemorrhaging money. When I was just 22 years old, my father passed away. He had been a proud man, a ruthless man, who had used the money he inherited from his royal predecessors to build a media empire the likes of which Britain had never seen before. He owned dozens of television stations, magazines and newspapers, both broadsheet and tabloid. In a way, he controlled the country by owning those companies, because whatever he decided to put in his news broadcasts or in his newspapers was what the country believed to be true. He could print a lie, some fabricated story with little or no truth, and yet the majority of the 80 million making up the population would look at it as gospel. He was the king of society and culture in Britain, and upon his death, I inherited that throne. But something was happening. The sales figures for my magazines and newspapers slowly began to dwindle. It was beginning to cost me more and more money to put them out with the regularity to which people had become accustomed, because I wasn't making the money back that I once was. It wasn't that the quality of the articles had decreased, or that the demand for them wasn't there. It just seemed that people stopped buying them. Over the coming months, after having to cut back on my publications and number of staff, it was brought to my attention that ratings on many of my television channels had plummeted. This baffled me even more. We made the best programming in the world, and that's not just me saying that. The shows we produced became hits not only in our own country but all over the world, with networks in the US, Canada, Australia, Europe and Asia, all buying the rights to broadcast the shows. Something was happening to change the buying and viewing habits of the nation, and I wanted to know what that was. Being brought up in a royal family, spending a lot of my childhood in a royal household in various parts of the country, had sheltered me from living the life of a real child. I wasn't allowed to mix with the common children who would play outside the gates of whichever stately home had been chosen as my residence. I wasn't allowed to roll around in the mud or play any games that might be considered dangerous. I couldn't even get into any kind of mischief because I was constantly followed by either a bodyguard or some kind of servant who was hired to take care of my every need. I hated it. I just wanted to live a normal life. As I was finishing my secondary education in a private grammar school paid for by my family no less, I had hoped to escape the world I'd been living in and go to a university where I could be among the common folk. But even that was denied to me, because I was a member of the royal family and only had two options: Oxford or Cambridge. Most people would probably love the idea of attending one of those schools, one of the top 2 universities in the country, but I never felt like I deserved to be there. I didn't win my place by having exemplary grades, even though I actually did. I hadn't even sent in an application. I was just accepted because of who I was, as it seems did a lot of the other people there. The student body wasn't made up of normal people. It was an assembly of posh Eton boys, most of whom seemed to be budding politicians, prudish girls who seemed to think that showing more than an ankle or a neck was vulgar, and stereotypical nerds, those who had actually earned their place at university but who were such outcasts in their previous years of education that they didn't bother to try to change the way they were seen at university. It was depressing. Then the time came for me to graduate. I had attained some of the highest points in the university's history and was glad to finally be out of the sheltered world of Cambridge life, when my father died, and I had no choice but to take over his companies, where I spent the next 12 years in offices, again isolated from my real workforce. Finally, I reached a point where I wanted to know what was going on with the general public to cause them to shun my products. I made the call to one of the television producers I had worked with, asking them to send his best makeup artist to my office. I had a job for her. When she arrived, I explained that what I wanted her to do was to make me unrecognisable to anyone who didn't know me intimately. She was to give me a prosthetic nose and chin, change my eye colour with contact lenses, buy me a wig, and then dressed me in street clothes that you would find in any normal high street store. I was going out onto the streets to talk with my real viewers and real readers in the hope of finding out what had happened to keep them from tuning in to my shows or from buying my papers and magazines. It took more than 2 hours to change my image so that even I couldn't recognize myself in the mirror. My eyes had gone from blue to brown, my hair from a mousy blonde to a dirty auburn, and my nose had become pointed and slightly crooked. The clothes I wore had clearly not been bought recently from a store, but it had instead come from the wardrobe department of a soap opera. When I asked why I was being dressed in such clothes, the makeup artist and her assistant gave me a strange stare as if to ask if I was being serious, only offering that I would find out as soon as I ventured onto the real streets of London. Heading out of the huge skyscraper I called my headquarters, I walked through the streets on foot, trying to get into character. The people I was going to see wouldn't be riding around in town cars, paid for by the company. They probably couldn't afford taxis. Hell, if they couldn't afford to even buy my cheapest paper, they probably couldn't afford a ticket on the Underground. Hundreds of businessmen and women in their fancy suits rushed past me, going about their daily rituals. Occasionally I would catch some of them staring at me, open-mouthed, almost pointing, as if I was trespassing on some kind of sacred ground. I felt like an alien dropped into the middle of a world I knew nothing about, and one which I would never belong to. I walked for miles with no real idea of where I was headed. I had never walked the streets of London before, always having a chauffeur to take me wherever I needed to be. If I'm completely honest, the walking was quite therapeutic. The only thing I can liken the feeling to is that of discovering something completely new. One of the only other times I had felt something even remotely similar was the first time I had ridden on a roller coaster. It was exhilarating. Finally, after about an hour, I came to a crossroads. To my right I saw the same kinds of buildings, vehicles and people that I had seen so far on my walk, none of them being what I had set out looking for. In front of me, running along the banks of the Thames, the commercial buildings appeared to give way to large homes, obviously occupied by the wealthy people working in the nearby offices. To my right lay a bridge. Unable to see across to the other side of the bridge with any real clarity, what I did notice was that the high-rise buildings were not skyscrapers. They were apartment blocks. The glass and metal that was so abundant where I was standing seemed to have been replaced by brick and concrete. There was a strange sense of silence, as if the noisy traffic and building sites didn't exist on that side of the river. Finally, most strikingly, what I noticed was that there were plumes of black smoke rising into the air, dancing wildly as if calling to me. I stepped onto the bridge, quickening my pace until I finally touched solid ground on the other side. What I saw shook me more than watching my father in his final days when he had swollen up to 3 times his normal size due to a build-up of water in his body, until he looked nothing like himself, his organs drowning inside his own skin. The streets were deserted. While cars had been queuing on the other side of the bridge, too many trying to move in the same direction to be able to move at any real speed, there were no cars to be seen here. Not one. Even the parking spaces in front of the homes were empty. Taking my first step off the bridge, I noticed the quiet, tranquil sound that came with no traffic. Was this still London? This was supposed to be one of the busiest cities in the world, and yet this seemed almost post-apocalyptic. I had seen countless movies over the years portraying the possibilities for life after a nuclear war, something which had thankfully not happened, despite being threatened for over 100 years. If it were to occur now, with the latest technological advances in weaponry, I doubt there would even be much of a civilization left. The one bomb that had been dropped, now 36 years ago, had turned Zimbabwe into a barren desert, where no living thing could survive. Now I had the feeling that I'd jumped through the screen and was living inside one of those motion pictures. There had to be some explanation. I kept looking around in all directions trying desperately to find someone to talk to, but no one appeared. Looking back toward the sky, I fixed my gaze on one of the plumes of black smoke and realized that my only hope of finding answers was to get to the source of that fire. Someone had to have lit it. 10 minutes later, a stench began to overwhelm me. The black smoke hung ominously overhead. The smell of burning rubber, plastic, even flesh wafted into the air. But that wasn't the only scent my nose was picking up on. Another unsanitary smell caused me to retch, bracing myself against a wall for fear of vomiting up my stomach. It was the smell of not only household waste, but of human waste as well. As I rounded a corner, my eyes finally meeting the bellowing flames arcing into the sky, I was struck by the sudden feeling of being transported 200+ years into the past. What I saw was something that you may have expected to see in Victorian or Dickensian London, not in the 22nd century. We were civilized. There were people gathered in the streets of all ages, tiny babies wrapped in what appeared to be dirty blankets, children in tattered, muddy clothes, many too big for the children in question, adults, male and female, looking like they hadn't washed in days, and elderly people, frail, maybe not far from death. The fire burning in the middle of the street was not part of some kind of ritual or rebellion. It was the only way for these people to stay warm as the weather began to turn harsh. As I slowly made my way close to the blaze, a man in his mid-60s approached me, asking if I needed anything. My heart almost broke. The man was filthy, the body odour wafting from him close to unbearable. His breath smelt like sewer water, and his face was beginning to show the sagging skin that can only be the result of losing too much weight too quickly. This man needed my help, and yet he was offering his to me. I told him that what I needed wasn't material. I simply wanted to know what had happened to this community to cause them to live in such a way. The man laughed and smiled, looking at me as if I were a child before he spoke. "Those toffs in the government and that dizzy old bag who calls herself the Queen," the old man spat with venom in his voice. He went on to tell me that while my companies were losing money, his and those of his friends had ceased to exist completely. The crippling debt they found themselves in forcing them to sell any form of luxury they had just to keep a roof over their children's heads. That was where all of the cars had disappeared to. The recession currently building in the UK had already hit the lower classes, and it had hit hard. I used to think that the class system of this country had long since been abolished, but I was wrong. Terribly wrong. The people I had walked past earlier in the day went about their daily rituals as if nothing had happened, and yet these people I sat with were struggling just to find enough food to feed their families, just enough to survive. There was a divide between the rich and poor of London, and it was huge.